Among the largest steam locomotives ever used on the British railway system were the LMS Garratt and the LNER U1, an extinct series of articulated locomotives that could deliver the power where necessary, but presented their own series of performance problems, ones that ultimately damaged their ability to work to their full potential. The Garratt configuration of steam locomotive is an articulated design that is primarily used to provide a larger engine with higher performance that can negotiate tight curves that would otherwise be too sharp for multi-axle engines. The main goal of both the Garratt and the similar Mallet configurations was to present motive power that avoided the need for smaller classes of locomotive to be used in multiple, requiring additional engine crews, the Garratt comprising separate axles and pony trucks, while a single frame connected the two, essentially forming two locomotives in one. While the Mallet configuration was the pride of the American railroads, featured on such classics as the Union Pacific Big Boy and the Norfolk and Western's 2156, the Garratt design, which placed the driving wheels ahead and behind the boiler, atop which was mounted the coal bunker, cab and water tank, was far more widespread, being introduced on the colonial railways of Africa, South America, Southeast Asia, Australia and New Zealand. The advantages of the Garratts were clearly illustrated, as these engines successfully managed trains on the winding, steeply inclined valley routes between Mombasa and Nairobi in Kenya, Durban to Cato Ridge on the Natal mainline of South Africa, and up the Cowan Bank and around Broadmeadow in New South Wales. For the LMS, the requirement for a larger engine came about upon its formation under the Grouping Act of 1923, whereby the previous Midland Railway had designed locomotives under a small engine policy, meaning that heavy freight trains often had to be hauled by multiple locomotives operated by several engine crews. This was a highly uneconomic method of operation, especially on the primary coal routes of the East Midlands around Towton near Nottingham, as well as on trains to London for the domestic coal supply, the demand for an alternative leading to LMS designers considering the development of several large Garratt-type steam engines that could perform the work of multiple Midland Railway classes in one. As for the LNER, the desire to use a Garratt design was solely for the purpose of banking on the Woodhead route, their main corridor across the Northern Peak District from Sheffield to Manchester, the line, which stretched for 41 miles, being an arterial route for coal traffic from the mines and pits of South Yorkshire to the manufacturers and power stations of Lancashire. This route, though, was severely constrained by the Worsborough Incline, a 7-mile ascent between Wath and Penistone that climbed at a rate of 1 in 40, and as steam locomotives routinely struggled to ascend the bank, with poor adhesion making it difficult to restart if the train ran out of power, the preceding Great Central Railway had considered the creation of a dedicated banking locomotive as early as 1910. Originally, they proposed a 4-cylinder Garratt engine based on the Robinson Class 8A 080 freight locomotive of 1902, but this was gradually evolved into a machine based on the underpinnings of the Robinson Class 8K of 1911, a 280 configuration, with approval for the LNER Garratt, designated Class U1, being given by the company management in 1924, with design of the locomotive handed over to Chief Mechanical Engineer Sir Nigel Gresley. In both cases, the LNER U1 and LMS Garratts were built by Beyer-Peacock and Company at their works in Manchester, the company having originally developed the Garratt loco configuration with mechanical engineer Herbert William Garrett in 1908, thus creating the Beyer-Garratt series of machines that were the power behind the overseas railways of the British Empire. Construction of LNER's U1 came first, with the locomotive being assembled in just 20 days between June 1st and June 21st, 1925, before it was released from the factory in time for the Stockton and Darlington centenary celebrations 10 days later. The LMS Garratts, meanwhile, were laid down in April 1927, with 3 initial units built, although rather than allowing Beyer-Peacock a clean slate on which to design a locomotive, using their tried and tested methods, the LMS drawing office at Derby were insistent that the Garratts incorporate the driving axle bearings and short lap valve gear from the Fowler Class 4F 060 freight engine of 1924, which itself was based on the Midland Railway 3835 class of 1911. The 4F and the preceding 3835 class were both flawed designs, primarily due to their short axle box bearings, which were prone to overheating, causing classes of this design to be limited to speeds no greater than 30 miles an hour in an attempt to mitigate this problem. The LMS Garratts thereby shared this flaw, as significant issues of overheating at speeds in excess of 30 miles an hour meant that their potential ability to provide the power of several engines in one unit was largely lost. This issue of overheating also meaning that they required frequent maintenance, which, due to their unique design, meant parts had to be custom-made which were expensive to source. Their sheer length also meant that dedicated stabling facilities at Tote and Roundhouse had to be built to accommodate the engines, but regardless of their faults, the LMS ordered another 30 examples from Beyer-Peacock, which were built between August and November 1930, and differed through the fitting of a revolving coal bunker, trialled on one of the original 3 prototypes, and used to prevent coal dust from entering the cab. The LNER's Class U1, meanwhile, was the sole member of its design, but even this had performance problems. As being the most powerful steam locomotive design of any type, the U1 was able to propel a train of over 60 wagons in length up the steepest part of the Worsborough incline. Problems emerged, however, when the engine entered siltstone tunnels, as due to the locomotive being positioned at the back of the train, the crew would suffer the effects of smoke inhalation. Attempts to introduce respirators for the crew of the U1 being halted after a short series of trials, when drivers and firemen refused to share the packs provided. Another problem was the engine being prone to corrosion, as the water used inside the U1 was very soft, and thus a protective layer of scale could not build up in the locomotive's tubes, the result being that within a year, the corrosion had become so bad that the locomotive had to be retubed in 1926, as well as causing the firebox to crack in both 1927 and 1928, requiring its replacement on both occasions. Performance-wise, the locomotive did well, but consumed so much coal and steam during a single ascent that the fire was practically exhausted by the time it reached the summit, and engine crews struggled to get the fire back to full force in the time taken to drift back down the bank, where another heavy freight train was usually waiting to be assisted. The issue of significant coal consumption was one endemic to both the LNER and LMS Garratts, which required a near-constant supply by the firemen in order to maintain the steam pressure needed to drive the locomotive, making both classes unpopular with engine crews. In terms of operation, the U1 spent nearly its entire life operating on the Worsborough Bank, usually making up to 18 round trips per day, while LMS Garratts were employed on heavy coal trains out of Towton in Nottinghamshire to Brent in North London. However, although these engines did well in their respective roles, their incredible strength and ability to haul heavy trains were impacted by the somewhat archaic design of contemporary wagons, with power having to be applied with great sensitivity due to it being not uncommon for the strength of these mighty machines to be able to rip the couplings off or crush wooden-framed wagons. These locomotives were also restricted on the number of wagons that they could haul due to the fact that they mainly comprised unbraked stock, with brake control for freight trains of this period being dictated by either the engine at the front or the brake van at the rear. Thus, the Garratts, with their ability to haul longer than normal trains, meant they suffered greatly from substantial brake wear, especially when descending banks such as Chinley, wherein the brake blocks of one Garratt were reported to have melted under the strain, resulting in future consists being split. Following nationalisation in 1948, Garratts were largely displaced by new forms of traction due to their high inefficiency and somewhat unique designs, the Class U1 operating on the Woodhead route until 1949, where the newly reformed British Railways proposed to continue a previous LNER incentive to electrify the main line between Sheffield, Penistone and Manchester with 1500-volt DC overhead wires. After electric services began on the Woodhead, the U1 was transferred south to the Lickey Incline on the main route between Bristol and Birmingham, the steepest sustained mainline railway incline in Britain, whereupon it worked alongside the unique Midland Railway Anderson 010, nicknamed Big Bertha, propelling various trains up the incline as they headed north into the West Midlands. In 1951, the locomotive briefly returned to its home ground at Worsborough Bank, and then converted to burn oil in 1952 so as to try and improve the engine's efficiency, but all proposals to revise the design came to naught as the boiler faced the end of its useful life. After a brief return to the Lickey between June and September 1955, the U1 was placed into storage at Gorton Works in Manchester, whereupon it was officially withdrawn on December 23rd and scrapped at Doncaster in 1956, having racked up 425,213 miles during its 30 years of operation. LMS Garratts, meanwhile, remained primarily on their home territory, while also taking on non-coal work around Wellingborough and the Hope Valley until they began to be replaced by brand-new BR Standard 9Fs from 1955, the last of the LMS Garratts, number 47994, being withdrawn in April 1958, and by 1960 all members of the class had been scrapped, bringing an end to the era of the Garratt-type locomotive on Britain's railways.